Hi everyone, this is Brock Allen from Developmentor. Thanks for coming to this second webinar that we have here on ASP.NET 5 and MVC6. This is the second part. As I mentioned, we're going to mainly talk about MVC6 in this session. And basically we are doing these webinars to promote our new class on ASP.NET 5 and MVC6. So feel free to come and check out our website, develop.com, and you'll be able to see that class, which will be running probably later this fall of this year. Okay? Well, I'll go ahead and get started here. So what we're going to look at here in this webinar is we are going to be covering MVC6, but before we dive right into that, we're going to cover a couple more features that are really part of ASP.NET 5, but they very much feed into MVC6. And that is the dependency injection system in ASP.NET 5, because it pretty much permeates the entire stack. So we'll see how that works. And then we'll look a little bit about the configuration system, because again, that definitely is going to help out your MVC applications. You're going to want to configure things like database connection strings, among other things. And then what we'll do is we'll move into MVC6, and we'll talk about what that looks like. MVC6 is a complete rewrite of MVC, and one of the main goals of MVC6 is to unify both Web API and MVC5, the prior two different frameworks. There was a lot of overlap between the two of them. So when we look at MVC6 here, when we talk about the routing, the way routing is done and the way parameter handling is done and model binding and things like that, that all basically is the same across both MVC and any kind of Web API style apps that you will be writing. I don't think going forward people will be calling it Web API, of course. They'll just be saying, I'm building an API, but I happen to be using MVC6 as the framework to do so. So we'll look at just, because there is so much overlap between those, pretty much all the general stuff related to MVC we'll see will be applicable to both. So that includes things like routing, which we'll look at, and I said parameter binding and things like that. MVC6, of course, is also helps out and supports building HTML-based applications. So we'll look a little bit about some of the changes in Razor, and there's a couple new features in Razor that we'll look at, which are kind of cool. And then we will, at the very end, talk a little bit about building API-style applications, because it definitely looks different than Web API did prior. So that's one of the things about MVC6 is it is rewritten from scratch, and the goal was to combine both MVC and Web API. And in general, when they designed MVC6, they kept the look and feel as much as possible from the original MVC or MVC5. Of course, then that means layering in Web API into MVC6 meant that some things had to look differently, and namely the pieces of MVC6 that have to do with Web APIs. So we'll talk a little bit about the end about what how things look if you want to build a Web API in MVC6. It's really actually not that big of a deal. It's pretty simple to do. So fortunately, on the base of MVC6, it feels pretty natural with everything else. So this is not obviously an extensive list of all the new and changing features in MVC6. This is really just kind of a smattering of this and that and the other thing that are of particular interest, at least that I thought, as people are learning this sort of new but the same framework as we had before. Okay, so to get started, actually, it turns out, so we did a webinar last week, and on last week I was actually demoing ASP.NET 5 beta, I think it was beta 4 that we were on, and so since then, Microsoft has released Visual Studio 2015. So previously I was running in a virtual machine, and now actually I have the real full-blown Visual Studio installed on my machine, and as part of that, they've also released beta 5 of ASP.NET 5 and MVC6. So that's actually what I will be demonstrating here. So again, we're still on beta. Of course, things are still very much subject to change, and I very much expect still even more changes before Microsoft releases this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and create a new web project here, and I'll just do an empty ASP.NET 5 template here, which really gives us just a bare bones application. I'm not going to include web application or web API. Again, these are real. Both of these are sitting on top of the MVC6 framework. It's just, do you want to build a web API style application or a HTML, more HTML focused application? That's what these other two templates do. I'm actually going to start with the bare bones. Empty project here. This will basically be ASP.NET 5, which just bare bones, no middleware, and we'll then add in the libraries as we need. So starting with an empty project, you'll then see you don't have to start with these templates. These templates tend to have a lot of code, and historically they've been very verbose. And so any kind of real application development using these templates, I tend to find is not very realistic. What you end up doing is if you start with these templates, you end up with a bunch of code that you don't need, you don't know, don't want, or don't even know how it works. And a lot of times people have to remove a bunch of code, or even worse, they leave the code in there because they don't know if they need it or not, and then it's sort of dead code. Which, of course, the more code you have in your app that you don't know how it works or you don't know what it's doing is potentially dangerous. Potentially an attack surface that you don't realize is there. So I very much prefer to start with an empty application and then add things as I need them. And that is actually very much kind of the one of the original design goals of ASP.NET 5 was to follow more of this Node.js style, where you really start with kind of a bare bones system, and then you just add things as you need them, which again is going in line with the whole you pay for what you need sort of model, as opposed to getting everything in the kitchen sink. Okay, so here we end up with a little README page, which of course is usually the first thing we end up deleting. We end up having here now our, sort of our startup file to configure our pipeline, which is the configure method down here at the bottom. We basically just have one middleware that's just simply saying hello world. I'll just run this real quick to show that it should work out of the box. And lo and behold, it does, right? It's just putting out text. And then the thing I want to focus on next is this other method here in our startup class, which is called configure services. So this is where the dependency injection system comes into play. Basically, this is where ASP.NET 5, strictly speaking, allows you to configure any dependencies that you might have in your system. Okay? So the whole idea here is that you could have things that maybe your middleware or that maybe some of your MVC code needs as dependencies. And so let's just come up with a public interface foo, just as a really simple example. Public class foo is going to implement this interface. And then there we go. So we have some sort of dependency that we are going to need within our application. We have a concrete implementation, and then elsewhere in our application we want to then depend on that via a dependency injection style, where that thing is passed into your code. And again, I guess I didn't really mention the motivation for dependency injection, but of course the idea here dependencies passed in as parameters, and therefore you end up with a more loosely coupled system where the layers are isolated, and you can do have a better time doing things like unit testing. So that's what the configure services is all about. It allows you to register things that you want in the dependency injection system, and so you do this off of this iService collection. And so there are various APIs here. There are basically three main APIs that you're going to want to use to register entries in the dependency injection system. So one here is this concept of a singleton, and you can basically say, hey, I need this foo thing in my dependency injection system. Foo is the concrete class that we are doing, and I want the dependency injection system to maintain one instance for the lifetime of the application. And so the very first time we need this foo instance, it will be created, and then it will be held onto for the lifetime of the app, and then it will be reused over and over and over. That's the API if you want the dependency injection system to instantiate the class for you. There's also a add instance foo, where you can then pass in the instance yourself. That's if you want to do whatever initialization. Okay. There's a different lifetime management, if you will, if you want a different sort of approach here. You might want an instance of this object, of this foo instance, every time it is asked for. Okay? So there's a different API called add transient. This will then, like I said, every time that you need this IFOO out of your dependency injection system, this instance will be created from scratch. And then there's sort of a halfway point between the two, which is the probably a very common, will be a commonly used one. It's called add scoped, and add scoped allows you to register a dependency in the dependency injection system that will be available for the duration of the HTTP request. So in other words, you might want to share this instance across anybody who needs it, but only within this one HTTP request into your server. So you can register the type, IFOO, the type of class, and then, like I said, the DI system basically creates this concept of a scope where for anything that needs this for the duration gets that same instance, and they manage the lifetime. And then when the instance, or I'm sorry, the request is finished, if this thing implements iDisposable, it will get cleaned up. Okay. Same thing with transient; those will get cleaned up, and then singleton will get cleaned up at the end of the application lifetime. So I don't know. It doesn't really matter which one we put in here because my implementation doesn't have any particular, constraints about its lifetime. So I can just pop in add transient. So then in the application, when you want to resolve one of these dependencies, there is a property of the HTTP context. So this is just some straight up middleware, very, very simple. Again, if you're not familiar with middleware, then the webinar we did last week covers that. So I would suggest you go back. The recording is available. And so on the context, there is something called request services. And this is basically the location that you go when you need to ask for one of these dependencies to be resolved. And so you can go up and just ask for this thing by the type. Again, I'm asking for the interface, not the concrete class, and then the concrete class then will get provided to me based on the lifetime sort of management that we've configured up here in configure services. So what I'll do here is instead of printing a hello world, I will take my foo and let's actually add a single method here, very simple, get foo. Again, whatever that is, this thing will implement it. Okay, and I'll have this thing return foo with a bunch of exclamation points. Okay, so pretty straightforward, nothing terribly complicated. We have registered this thing in our DI system. We can then ask for it, and then later on we can use the method. So if I go back over here to my browser and hit refresh, right, there we go. We're able to see this guy. Okay, so pretty straightforward. In this case, again, the add transient. If I requested this twice, like foo1 and foo2, for example, then we would end up getting this instance getting created twice because we asked for it twice. If it were scoped instead, then these two would be the same instance. And if it were singleton or instance, then this would be shared across multiple HTTP requests. Okay, so fairly straightforward with the DI system. If you ever used, AutoFac or anything else like that, then then this is a very, very similar thing. There's a question I see there. Is it possible to configure the DI system using a configuration file? No, there's nothing that I've seen so far that allows you to do this in configuration. Of course, you could always build your own configuration and then do your own sort of declarations this way, though, but nothing provided by Microsoft as far as I've seen. One of the things about this, though, is that, of course, Microsoft is very open about all the development here. So you can go to GitHub, ASP.NET, and then you can go to this organization up on GitHub, which is the Microsoft organization, and go through the various projects. And, you can go find the dependency injection system somewhere in here, if I cruise through this far enough. And I probably went past it already, actually. Oh, here it is. There's the dependency injection system. So what I'd suggest is if you really want this to be loaded from configuration file, you go open up an issue, right? You go open up an issue and you say, hey, it would be a really nice feature if we could do that. I have a guess as to what their answer will be, but at least you can let them know that this is something that you actually would want. Okay, so I think you guys get the idea. This is all, given their Microsoft's attitude about developing this in the open, feedback from people using this is actually pretty useful to them. So that would be a good point of feedback. Okay. So what else do we have here? Oh, well, actually, you had mentioned configuration system. That actually kind of leads us to our next topic. So I talked about the dependency injection system here. The slides for this will all be available, so this kind of covers what I'm going to cover. So again, here are the various ways to register your dependencies and then access it in your application. Okay, so the next thing to think about is the configuration system. The configuration system, basically, if you notice over here on the right, we don't have web.config anymore. Web.config is not really part of this new ASP.NET 5 approach because ASP.NET 5 possibly may not be configured in, IIS. So IIS also used web.config for some of its configuration, as well as the older ASP.NET. In this new ASP.NET 5 system, which is really a totally new web server, framework, really independent of the prior ASP.NETs, the configuration, they've taken a little bit more of a different approach with it. They're very much sort of going with the approach because we might need to run on many different platforms because of the whole approach with ASP.NET Core being cross-platform, is that the configuration system needs to be pretty flexible, but also accommodate different deployment environments and different sort of environmental things, as it were. And so the prior configuration system that we used to have with web.config and the concept of the web.config transforms based on debug or release mode was just never really felt great. So let me show you what the configuration system looks like now, and then you can decide on your own if you like it or not. But it is kind of flexible in its approach because it allows you to support multiple different configuration stores, if you will. So you could put configuration data in like JSON files if you want. You could put stuff in XML files, I suppose, if you wanted to. They even support INI files, like the gold INI files. Actually, here's one as well that they're using for their own web host code. And then they also support environment variables. So the configuration system is flexible in terms of many different locations for configuration data. So let me show you how this works. So what we're going to do is, what you have to do is create a builder. Actually, you know what? Let me do this up in the constructor here. And it'll be clear why I'm going to do this in the constructor in a minute. So I'm going to create a configuration builder, B-U-I-L-D-E-R. Okay. This is a dependency that we're already referencing. And the configuration builder ultimately will produce an I configuration like this. And to get that configuration, you use builder.build. Okay, so you kind of build up the configuration file, and then you call this build method, and it then gives you a way to read the configuration file. The configuration builder then has various extension methods to indicate what the different sources of configuration data would be. So again, I think a very common one, especially if you're going to do like cloud hosting or maybe even run on Linux or something like that, would be to allow environment variables. So if you want to be able to read values from an environment variable, there you go. You can add this environment variable. As I mentioned, though, there are others. They have, I guess, command line parameter support. They have INI file support, the INI files. I also said they have JSON support, but that's actually in a different library. So I need to pull that in here. So I'm going to go to my project.json file, and I'm going to add in Microsoft.configuration. I'm now going to have to remember, is this in framework.configuration.json? I think that's the name of it. So one thing I will mention is in the prior version of this that I did last week, I was in one of the release candidate, I think, or one of the release candidates of Visual Studio, and the IntelliSense in here was much better for querying NuGet. And for some reason in the release, it's off. There's something different. I can't quite put my finger on it, but sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Anyway, it looks like from memory, I got the right one, so we're able to resolve our references here properly. And notice my now Microsoft Framework configuration.json. And so what the JSON does is it allows us to then also add JSON file, okay? And we can indicate the name of some, config.json file, for example, that I want to load in. So let me just show you that we can load in from these couple different locations. Now, one other thing we need, by the way, is the configuration builder needs to know the directory from which our application is running. This is actually something they also changed recently. I don't know if it's going to end up like this once it releases, but they decided that they need to pass in the directory. And this is actually like the physical directory. So I need to know which directory I am running from. And so I can do that by having the I application environment passed in as a dependency into my startups constructor. So this actually kind of gets back to the DI system, is that dependency injection is actually all throughout the system. It is not just in your ASP.NET layer. It's actually out of the DNX system itself. So again, we talked about DNX last week as the loader for the version of .NET that we are loading. And so even your startup class, its constructor can receive hosting level configuration information. So anyway, that's what this I application environment is. It's basically information about the environment. And so that has a property called application base path. Okay? Okay, so that's configuration builder. This is the directory. I'm going to load from config.json. So let's go add a config.json. Here in my file, config.json. Okay, and then I can put whatever JSON configuration I want. So I'll call this thing app. I'll even do a little bit of hierarchical configuration. Maybe my app name, and this is Brock's demo, for example. Okay, so great. I have a config file, and I have some information in there. Now, hopefully, if this saves okay without crashing Visual Studio. Oh, this doesn't look good. We'll see how this comes back in a second. I guess what I was about to say, oh, here it came back, is that we actually now have indicated two sources for our configuration data. One is from this JSON file, and this other one's from an environmental variable. What happens is basically if there are conflicts, then the last one wins. So you're basically kind of saying, hey, start with this file, but then allow the environment variable to override one of those values. Okay, so I am configuring this in my startup class. I'm doing it in the constructor. I'm just sticking this configuration as a member variable, and again, I'm bootstrapping this off of injection from the DNX system, and it's passing to the application environment. What I want to do then, the whole point of pulling this in like this, was to then I want to build a configuration class. So I'm going to build a public class, my config, and I'm going to have in here something like prop string. App name, for example, okay, to kind of mirror what I have in my my JSON file. So what I want to do then is into the DI system, I would like to inject my configuration object. So actually, that's what I'm going to do. I am going to do services.addInstance. I'm going to do my config, and then I'm going to initialize this app name from my configuration file. And so config is the API to read from the configuration builder that I had constructed there. And what I can do is I can read out my values. So one way to read values is you can call this get function, and you pass in a string, which is the key to read out of the config file. Now normally if my app name were up here, app name, then that would be my key, Brock's app or whatever. And so app name would be the key. It seems pretty straightforward that that's what you would use. But my app name is actually nested under this nested structure. And I did that on purpose because you might want a grouping of things, of course. But you need a way to be able to query that. So what you do is you use sort of a pathing-like syntax in here of app:\app name. And the reason that works, or the reason they do it this way, is that it gives you a mechanism to query hierarchical configuration stores, like your JSON file, but this would also work perfectly well from your environment variable. So your environment variable could be called that as well, and that would be a way to sort of trump the config file approach. All right, so then what we can do is go into our application down here and maybe do context.requestServices.getRequiredService, and I can now ask for my config file instead. Okay, so I won't use the foo guy anymore. I will just grab this guy, and I can now do config.appname, for example. And back over here in my browser, if I hit refresh, then hopefully that all loaded up just fine. It looks like it did. Okay. Now, actually, you know what? Let me go back. I'm going to undo this because I want to go back to what I was doing a second ago. I'm going to show you then how this actually plays quite well with the DI system. So back to this, I said I wanted the ifoo, and the foo had some sort of function called getFoo. I actually want my foo class. Again, sorry for such silly abstract names. But what I want to do now is inject the config into here. Okay. And so maybe the version of getFoo now returns the config dot what I call it, app name, I believe, something like that. Okay. Oh, I need an instance field for this. Okay, cool. So now what's happening is I am putting into my DI system this config object, and then this class called foo. Foo depends on the config object, and then when down here we try to resolve foo, we should see that we end up getting the dependencies unwound. So actually, maybe we'll change this slightly to say return app name from the foo class, for example, just to show that this actually worked, hung together. Okay, awesome. And the other thing, actually, I could even show you, and this actually gets back to the DI system. I meant to show this earlier, but I forgot. The DI system is available in many, many places. I showed you we can, explicitly resolve dependencies, but we can also do that in our classes as well. So I know I haven't shown MVC yet, but once I plug in MVC, we'll see that our MVC controllers can receive these as dependencies. Or if you're actually creating middleware, you can also set up your own middleware, and because a middleware is a class, it too can receive like an ifoo as an instance, for example. Okay. And so maybe in my invoke here, what I do is I do http context.response.write async, and I'll do _ foo.getFoo, and this is then in my middleware, for example, like that. Okay, let's return this because that's an async method, and then my startup class, actually I'll no longer do the run. I will just do app.use middleware, my middleware. Okay. So again, the whole point here is that then our middleware is going to get instantiated. It receives the ifoo. The ifoo needs the my config, and again now, if this all lines up, I'm now running my middleware, which is getting the foo dependency, which is then getting the configuration file. Okay, cool. That's kind of a combination of the DI system and your configuration system. So just to show you then that the environmental variables work, we can do those as well. So if you right-click your project, since I'm running out of IIS, I don't really have a command shell to configure an environment variable, but I can do this from the project properties window. So in here we have environment variables, and I could add a new environment variable called app name, and then in here I could put some val from the environment, like this, for example. Okay, so I save that, and actually I think all I should have to do is refresh in my browser. Okay. And, oh, maybe not. Actually, yeah, because we kicked off IIS Express, so this might require an IIS reset. There we go, from environment variable. Okay. Oh, and I even have a typo in there. By the way, the project properties that I'm setting in here, once I can fix that, these actually are just going into under your project properties folder. There's a launch settings.json. And that is basically what is configuring the IIS Express settings. So this is actually kind of a nice thing, again, because we don't rely upon magic tooling from Visual Studio necessarily. When we launch this from IIS, IIS is being initialized from this pretty simple text file. So again, like I said last week, they want to allow this kind of stuff to potentially run from without using something like Visual Studio. Okay. So Bob had a question about, the configuration. Yeah, absolutely, Bob. So your question was if I had like a third level, then absolutely, this could go, indefinitely deep up to your JSON file. Absolutely. Okay. Okay. One more common thing is the very common thing to want to have then is something like a debug file or a release version of this file. So again, hopefully you guys can tell that what's happening is the merge is happening at runtime on these things. Now the debug file I may or may not want because I'm in a debug environment. So on the environment, there's actually a property which is called the configuration. So it's whether or not we're in debug or release mode. And so this value is kind of passed in as sort of like a parameter here. And so what I can do is I can dynamically substitute this in with the right value. Okay? And to do that, I'm actually going to use one of the newer C# features here from Roslyn. Is this, I don't even know the name of this thing. It's basically where you can have the string.format done for you based on a variable that is in scope. So env is in scope, and I can do .configuration. I put this thing inside of curly braces, and then if I start my string with a $, then the compiler will pop that in there for me at the string.format call at compilation time. So I can go back over here. Now this is actually going to fail because I don't have that file. So here's the new yellow screen of death, if you will. It's a sort of a sad face, and basically that file, it says it can't be found, and that's because I don't have a config debug. Actually, let's even put this in the debugger to see what we get. So if you look here, this environment thing has debug. Okay, so I don't have then over on the right a config.debug.json. All right, so you may not have that. So of course this might be something that you want to be marked as optional. So this allows you to put in whether or not the config file needs to be there or not. So I'm saying I need to have a config.json, but if you have a debug one, well, that's optional. And of course we could pop that in there as well. Config.debug. That's the top level one. Let's go to the debug one. So this is Brock's, in debug mode. Okay, and again, this still is not going to work, I think, because I still have the environment variable as well. So actually, the environment variable still trumps all of those. But if I were to go into the environment, get rid of my environment variable without messing everything up. Okay, so we have this kind of nice, cascading sort of config system. So this is their attempt to solve the configuration, problems of the past, and also work cross-platform in a reasonable manner. Okay, one more question here. I was reading it from a JSON file that has arrays. I've never tried arrays, and the only reason I'm a little hesitant about your question is because I just remember in the last day or two seeing on the issue tracker somebody complaining about arrays not working properly. So I've never tried it. So you would have to try it, or we could try it later. But I don't know. I've never tried. So I'm not sure how that would work. So it might just be that they don't support it, and that was the issue on the issue tracker. So again, that's the nice thing about the issue tracker. You can kind of see what the pulse of the system, of the code is that they're building. What things are supported and what's not. So I would, I'd be maybe go look that up on the issue tracker and see if you can find the issue that I'm talking about, and see if that's what somebody's asking for, is that arrays actually be supported. Okay. So I think we have enough basis here to now move into MVC. So MVC, it turns out, so there's the configuration system. So MVC is just another NuGet package here on top of ASP.NET 5. So adding in MVC, you don't need a lot of ceremony, a lot of wizards or anything. You can just go into the config file, or I'm sorry, not the config file, the JSON file, and then add in Microsoft ASP.NET .mvc. Okay, so this is an example of one of the NuGets that works in here, whereas some of the others just don't for some reason. Anyway, we now have MVC, right? Simple as that. You just pull in a NuGet, and now we're able to go write MVC code. Now, before we can just go start writing MVC code, it turns out that the way MVC works is that MVC is just middleware, just like anything else. So if I'm going to use MVC, I need MVC's middleware to be in place. Okay, so this middleware then will receive a request, and then if the URL coming in matches a URL to one of your controllers, then MVC kicks in and will handle the request. If not, it will pass it by and let the rest of your middleware go and do its thing. Now, MVC, of course, is highly configurable, and it turns out MVC requires dependency injection for a bunch of their own internal functions, if you will. So to use MVC, I need to make sure that I have added all of the MVC services to the dependency injection system. And so MVC, I think, adds 120 or so of these various dependencies into the dependency injection system. So it just has all kinds of things like the interface that will do model binding, or the interface that does the view engine, creation, or whatever. Okay, so again, MVC itself is designed with tons and tons of dependencies injected, and so it needs that to do its job. Of course, then it will ultimately create your controllers, and then your controllers then themselves may have dependencies which can be used, from the rest of the DI system. When you're configuring MVC, the configuration that you might have done in the past on MVC, like setting up global filters or setting up the view engine or something like that, this is basically done in the services configuration. So on top of the add MVC extension method here, they have then a helper function called configure MVC, and they basically hand you the MVC options as a parameter to this lambda function, this callback function. And so they basically set up the default configuration here, and then they call you back and they allow you to then tweak the configuration, change anything you might want to change. So for example, if you have a global filter, right, and you want to add the global authorized filter, or whatever filter you're using, you could do that here. If you want to then tweak like I said, how anti-forgery works, right? What's the cookie name for anti-forgery? You could do that here. Or if you want to configure like the view engines, right? You can add a new view engine here. You would do that here. Okay. So if you have any sort of global configuration for MVC beyond the default settings, then you do that in here. Down here, then, the use MVC. This is actually where it registers the middleware. But the other thing that this does is it also allows you to configure the routing table. So if you recall with MVC, you would set up some sort of routing table where you said, hey, this, you would put templates in here for the controller and the action that you want to allow, and you would set up whatever templates you want. So that's actually done here on the extension method registering the middleware. And in a similar pattern, what they do is they hand you via a lambda expression the configuration object that you're allowed to configure. And here you do, they hand you the actual routing table itself. So again, routing is totally rewritten here for ASP.NET 5. Routing is its own feature, and MVC is, of course, depending on it. And so this is pretty much like what you were used to before, right? You would map a route, you would call it the default route, and then you would pop in that default template for your route like this. One of the things that's a little bit different here is that you then also had, if you recall, there was a placeholder here where you could put in defaults, where maybe you want a controller to always be home and action to always be index. But they have now a new way to express your default values, and you do so by putting it in line here. After the actual parameter name, you actually put in the name that you want to be the default, for example. Okay, so you can do map route with controller/action, and if there is no action, you would like it to be the word index, and if there is no controller, then you would like it to be the word home. Okay. Again, you can register multiple routes. You can put whatever combination of static content plus your dynamic placeholders using the curly braces for your parameters. Okay. I'm trying to think what else here about this. That's pretty much the basics with the routing here. That's pretty much what most people have, at least that route. The other thing though is that you don't have to use this routing. One of the things they added to the prior MVC was the concept of attribute routing, and so it turns out attribute routing is enabled by default. So I don't have to do anything. I could just use the bare bones use MVC, and then I still have attribute routing enabled by default. Okay, but whatever, we can put both in here. It doesn't really matter. You always get attribute routing. So then, once you have the MVC middleware and you have the MVC, dependency injection system all configured, then we just create controllers and views, and we're kind of back to the way we were back in the prior MVC6. I'm sorry, MVC5. And so I can add a new item. I can create a MVC controller, right? We still have the controller base class. They added a feature here in MVC6 where you can do what's called a POCO controller, and it's a controller with no controller base class. But to be honest, I don't know a lot of people that actually really are dying for that feature. It's really not that onerous, at least in my opinion, to derive from controller. Pretty much if you were going to do a POCO controller, there are a few things that you would have to do to get access to things like the HTTP context, and that's pretty much all the base class is doing for you. I guess the base class also provides you a bunch of convenience functions for creating action results. So anyway, the point is, I'm not going to bother demoing it, but if you really wanted POCO controllers, you could do it. Okay. So here's kind of the typical pattern, right? You have the controller, you have your action methods. These are going to be invoked when a web request comes in. We now return action result. So back in MVC, it used to be the action result based class, but they've now refactored this into action result. So this is an interface. And then you render, you can either render content or views or whatever, or a redirect result. Again, that would be a very common thing as well from a typical web app. But here, I'll just do a traditional view, and I will call the view index. Same behavior as the old MVC. If you don't pass a view here, then the view is end up getting automatically selected based on the name of the action. Personally, for me, I always was preferred to be explicit about those. So again, that pretty much works the same way that it did in the prior version of MVC. So that means I need a view folder over here. So I'll go create a folder called views. They don't quite yet have the tooling where you right-click and it'll add it for you. So we have to do this manually, at least for the time being. Create a directory called home, and in here I can put a view called, in this case, index. Okay. So here I'll just pop in h1. This is my home page, for example. Okay. All right. So I should be able to run this now because what's going to happen is request is going to come in. The only middleware I have is the MVC middleware, and when actually it looks like if I have nothing in the URL or in the path, then home/index should be selected. So I really should be accessing this directly if I just do Control F5. And so hopefully I'm not lying. And there we go. We got our beautiful home page. So a few things about this is that, of course, I am accessing this by the routing table here. I also said that attribute routing is enabled. So the way attribute routing works is that you can just put this route attribute, and let's just call this index, for example. And here now I can go back to my page and do / index, and it still works, right? So we end up going directly to, based on this path coming in. And you can make this as deep as you want, foo bar baz /index for whatever reason. And I can paste that into the URL and hit enter, and it should still come here. I don't know if you guys have been noticing, by the way, that all I'm doing is hitting save in here and then going back to my browser and hitting refresh. I mentioned in the first webcast last week that was another big feature that they wanted in ASP.NET 5 was the more modern developer workflow, as it were. So in prior MVCs, you actually would have to compile this, right, explicitly in Visual Studio to get the bin directory and the code behind and all that all compiled. And we don't have that here. So this is taking advantage of Roslyn, and all I have to do is save the source file, hit refresh in the browser, and Roslyn will kick in and auto recompile, the files, and they will just run. So that's kind of a nice, nifty little feature they've added. Okay, so attribute routing is there. One of the things about attribute routing is that you can combine, you can put them at the class level as well as the action method level. So there used to be something like a route prefix, and I think that's gone now. So instead, you just put the route at multiple levels in your hierarchy, and what happens is they get combined. So by virtue of having a route at the class level and a route at the action method level, then the request into this page is going to have to be, so that this should now fail because nothing matches that, which makes sense. And now for this to work, I need to have home/index, and that will now line back up. Okay. Now, one of the things we've accidentally done here is we've killed we've eliminated the ability to come just to the home page. So you would think, oh, well, I can just add another route, which you can. You can have multiple routes on an action method, and they will either work. Both of them will work. And so I'm putting the empty string. And so I don't think this is going to quite work yet. No, it didn't quite work. And the reason is, if you have a parent route, then what's happening is they get combined. So by having put the empty string here, actually what I have to do is I still have to come to home, but not necessarily /index, and then that will work. So that's a little funny, though, because that's not really what I wanted. So the route will always concatenate, if you will, with a slash to the inherited route attribute, unless you put a tilde at the beginning, or slash. So it can be either slash or tilde slash, either one. And what this is basically doing is saying, no, don't inherit from the route, just use whatever explicit value I've put here. And so now if I go back and hit refresh with just the blank path, that should now work. And it did. Excellent. Okay, so anyway, there's some settings related to routing and mapping to our action methods. Okay, I have to kind of get moving here because I'm a little bit behind, I think, on where I want to be. But I talked about the attribute routing. We talked about that. We still have the whole feature where you can go in and do HTTP GET and HTTP POST, so that's still there. We still have model binding. So if you have int parameter, or you have some sort of input model, data structure that's being passed in, that pretty much still works. The model binding will work with formula encoded data, query string, or route parameter binding. I'm going to talk a little bit more at the end about Web API binding, because that data is typically coming from content type directives from the HTTP request, where the payload and the body may not be formula encoded. So I'll talk about that at the end. But in terms of normal web page model binding, it's all going to work pretty much the way it did in the prior versions of MVC. Areas are still supported as well. It's done a little bit differently. You have to put in an area route parameter into the routing table, and then you indicate your controllers are in an area by putting an area attribute, which is really just a route constraint. And then all of your views still have to be in the same place that they used to be. So areas are still there if you like that feature. Okay, let's talk about Razor pages here. So one of the things I got here is when I rendered my page, if you actually look at the generated HTML, you'll notice, oh, all I got was an H1 tag. I actually didn't get a full-blown HTML page. And so usually that's because we use layout templates. And so layout templates are still here. They still go in the shared directory, which is what people are expecting. And so I can add that here. They even have a nice little wizard item, a layout page, and I'll just pop that in there. And it gives you kind of your standard HTML doc type and then the render body in the middle. Okay, so that's all great. But for my web page, to use the layout page, then I have to be explicit, and I have to say, yes, I want that layout page. So there's still the same layout property as before. The layout property is a little bit improved from the way it was in the prior versions. In the prior version, we used to have to do like views shared blah 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 .cshtml. That's now changed. When you indicate a layout, they're just going to use the same view location mechanism as a normal view location would be done. So you just use _layout, and that's discovered. The other thing you could do then is, instead of doing it explicitly, so I guess I'll comment that out, you can have it the layout configured in one location, which of course is the good old view start file. So the view start file is, again, still here from the last version of MVC. Okay, so same thing, the layout, you just put the name of the layout, and now with the presence of the view start, I should be able to hit refresh, and now it should be combined into one big HTML file with my homepage stuff in the middle, and then the layout template all around. Okay. There's another kind of global file in here. So again, notice the view start here is in the views directory. There's another global file that they've added called view imports. And so what the view imports file is it's sort of a way to do shared configuration across all your views. So you can also, always do like the whole, namespace feature where I want all my views to have this namespace included in them. So that's kind of the idea with the view imports. The view imports also allow you to use a couple new things, which we'll talk about in a few minutes as well. That have to do with something called a tag helper. Okay. So anyway, the view imports is this new kind of global file, and it's for basically not repeating yourself in terms of declarations that you might be putting at the top of every view, typically having to do with things that affect the compilation process. So like I said, namespaces and things like that. Okay. So I'll come back to that in a minute. I just wanted to pop that in there to get it there. So it was ready. Okay, so I talked about this already. So we have pretty much all the same standard Razor directives that we had before. So in your web page, you can put model and the using statement, and we have sections like we did before as well. The old helper is gone. So if you ever use that, I used it a few times, but not a ton. But anyway, that doesn't seem to be there anymore. I don't know if that means they don't plan on bringing it back, or I don't know what. But anyway, at least it's not there as far as I was able to tell. They have a couple new directives, inject and add tag helper. So this is the one I'll talk about this one in a minute. Inject allows you to do dependency injection in the view itself. So here's basically how you would do this. If you're in a view and you want to inject something from the dependency injection system, you can use @inject to do that. And you indicate the type, and then it injects it into a property that you indicate here. So then this config property will be a property of your compiled page. I guess I didn't really talk about DI within the controllers. Hopefully you guys believed me when I said you could do this. So in my controller, if I did want to accept the I options of, I forgot what I called it now, my options, my config, I guess. You can do this. So config dot, options dot, app name, for example. Or maybe you just put this into a variable. Okay. And then maybe down here you could do the good old viewbag dot, app name equals _config dot app name, for example. And again, that pretty much is the same sort of MVC code that you might have written before. Okay. And it did not work. Why is my app name not that? Viewbag app name, my controller. Let's put a breakpoint here to see if that worked. So this is here, and it's called, ooh, it's null. Did I mess up my, oh, sorry. I didn't talk about this options thing. My config is in the DI system, sorry. I didn't quite have time to mention this. There is another part of the configuration system that layers then on top, and that is a thing called an I options of your config. I didn't have actually time to talk about that. It is in the slide, so it's just a kind of a common pattern around injecting configuration throughout your system. So I still am not sure why I didn't get this. Did I uncomment the stuff from earlier? Nope, this is still here. I added that into the DI system. Put a breakpoint here to see if this is working. Yep, that's here. Okay. And so then here, when I run this, I have the data still there. And then in index, I have my viewbag. And that doesn't look good. Huh, it's not very happy. Oh, it showed up though. Okay, weird. I'm not quite sure what, maybe restarting something. I probably had a mistake, so. Okay, at least that works the way I would expect it to after a few restarts. Okay, cool. So what were some of the other things I wanted to talk about? So I mentioned injection as well, so you can do it in your views or in the controller itself. So here, let me talk about this next thing, which are called tag helpers. These are pretty interesting. Tag helpers are the replacement for HTML helpers. So we used to have like the using, HTML.begin form, and then we'd have some sort of, div, and in here we'd do HTML.label or label for. I don't have a strongly typed model here, but you could even do labels, right? And you could then enter your, the user's name and whatever. Okay. So the problem with these is that, once people started using things like Bootstrap, adding in the CSS classes to these elements became very, very painful. And so because these were not really HTML, they're like a function call that returned your HTML. And so Microsoft realized, okay, well, we need to maybe make this better. And so I'll come back to this example here in a minute, and I'll show you how the new built-in tag helpers replace the old HTML helpers, although the old ones still are there. But what a tag helper is basically a way for you to come into the markup and inject your own elements or attributes. So we could do this as a div where you do something like app name, for example. Putting dashes is typically a very common way to do that. So you can come in here and invent your own. I've never tried it with a dash in the name. This may or may not work. I'm not sure. But the whole idea here is that you want to invent your own tag or your own attribute. And so what's going to happen is then there's going to be code that backs these things. And so your code then can participate in the rendering of this element or of its own entire element. Okay? So let me do the attribute-based approach here first. Pretty straightforward here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an attribute, a tag helper called app name. So let's do that real quick. App name tag helper, for example. And so what a tag helper is a class that derives from tag helper. Okay. And then you can override this method called process. There's also an asynchronous version of this. And what happens here then is when Razor sees that your tag helper is here, it will then, and when it is rendering this element, it will invoke your process function or process async, and they hand you this tag helper output, and this output allows you to manipulate the content. And you know what, link is actually getting in my way here because I have way too many overloads. And so you can like append to the output. I think you can just set the so you can just set it to be, this is my tag helper, for example. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is to tie this all into everything else, just to show you the DI system. We'll do the config thing like I did before. Okay, and then my tag helper is going to simply render the name of the application that has been loaded from the config file. Okay. So the tag helper output guy allows you to affect the rendering. And so you can do that by modifying attributes. There's also an attributes property here, or you can actually set the content, the contents of the tag itself. You can even change the tag. You can eliminate the tag. So you really have a lot of control. So this reminds me of back in the web form days when we had custom controls. So, you know, some people might reel at this. They may say, "Oh, hold on, this is getting a little too crazy." Like it was, you know, like the web controls used to be a little too much abstraction. So anyway, it's up to you to determine how much or how little of this that you want to involve. Do these replace the editor and display template? That's a really good question. Actually, that's an area in MVC6 that I haven't looked into yet. So I have no idea the status of editor templates. I still think there's HTML like display for model, so these still exist. So you can still have your editor templates and your display templates like before. I just don't know if there's a tag helper that triggers the display for model. So I wouldn't say yes to your question exactly. So the editor and display templates still exist, and you could probably build one of these that trigger those if you wanted to, right? You could do like person, right? Maybe you wanted an editor template for person. Maybe you could do that. It actually turns out, so related to your question, it actually turns out that some of the built-in ones that Microsoft has created to replace the HTML form and the HTML, you know, the label and the text box and all those, it turns out those are actually still implemented in terms of the old HTML helpers. So these new things that Microsoft has really just sits on top of the HTML helpers that already existed. So I don't know of one specifically for, you know, your model. I mean, maybe, hey, ASP model. Maybe we'll see this in the future. I don't know, but right now I'm not certain that there is one. Okay, so let's just see if this app name thing works, just to kind of give you an idea here. So back to my app name tag helper. I injected some config. So again, even these things have DI. I can then tweak, you know, modify the element. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is this tag helper context gives you information about the source tag. So in other words, they actually will pass you in like the attributes that are on the existing one. So in essence, what's happening is there's kind of a this is what's there, and this is what's going to be rendered. And so it's up to you to decide. Don't remove the things from the source to the rendering, for example. Okay, I'll show you how, as we go along here. But this is a very simple one, just to show you some base mechanics. Okay. So one last thing, though, for these to work, I have to register my tag helper. And so when you do tag helpers, there's this thing called target element, and you can basically say a few things here. You can say, oh, the element has to be a div, for example. Or if you're going to do that app name, like a custom element, you could do this. So I'll give this a try. I'll see if this works, app-name. This is basically saying, I want my tag helper to actually be an entire tag all by itself. Interesting. So we'll go in here and do app-name. Okay. So that's the first sort of declaration that I have. The next one, though, is that I also want this to be available as an attribute. And so you can do attributes, and you can say app-name here. And what this is basically saying is, also allow the tag helper to be activated by the virtue of it being an attribute. Okay. So I'm not sure if you would want to allow this one to do both. It's sort of design, tag helper by tag helper. If you want to allow it, if you'd prefer it to be invoked as an attribute versus a tag, that would be up to you. But the mechanics of the library allow you to have it work either way. So that's how you target this thing. And then the last thing, like I said, is I have to register this. And so I want this tag helper available in my view. So there's a directive at the top called add tag helper to register it. I'm actually going to do that in the view imports just to illustrate that this thing works. So add tag helper, you put the name of your class, and then this is actually the fully qualified class name. So it's actually namespace and assembly name. And so I need that whole thing. And then this basically then makes this class, this app name tag helper, available here for my index to use. And I'm going to close the editor here and then reopen it because the Visual Studio Editor is supposed to change slightly, but I don't see it. All right, let's just see if this works in the browser. What's supposed to happen is if it recognizes that you're using, that this attribute or this element is a tag helper, it's supposed to make this visually a little bit different. I think what it does is it bolds it and turns it purple. But anyway, check it out. This worked. So this actually got worked both as a tag and as an attribute. And in terms of how this rendered, notice the app name here. It actually kept the tag app name, and then for the div, it just set the content inside. Okay. So again, you may not want to keep the attribute. You may not want to keep the tag, and there are ways to do that. For example, what I could do is I could do output.content.tag type, not content, sorry, tag type, tag name. So actually we could do something like if the tag name is equal to, if the tag name is app name, then I want to do output.tagname equals the empty string. So in essence what I'm doing is I'm actually saying, if we're using it as an element, remove the element from rendering, or change it to a div. Maybe you could change it to a div instead, for example. So if I go back and hit refresh, notice that one now changed to a div. Okay? Or if you left it blank, then it would end up getting rid of the tag altogether. So again, it's up to you how you design that. So. Okay, good. So those are what tag helpers are. So you can build your own tag helpers, but of course Microsoft has some, and like I said, the whole point of these tag helpers is to replace the HTML helpers that we had before, or at least give you a way to have much more native feel to your HTML that you're writing, so that you have more control over the tag. So there's Microsoft, ASP.NET, MVC, and Tag Helpers, Beta 5. Okay, so I'll grab this one. And so that now pulls in the Microsoft Tag Helpers. It is a different NuGet, so this is an optional, opt-in sort of thing. And then when you're building your form, we no longer use @HTML form, we just do form. And then here, you would do your label, enter the name of the person, maybe you have your input element, and then maybe we want some validation, things like that. Okay, so I'm going to fill this all here in a minute, so I'll put a button, to submit. Okay, so actually to do this, I guess I'll put a model in here real quick. So I'll have a view model, and I will just pop in real quick a class called, person. Maybe I'm editing a person, and maybe it's the name of the person. Okay. So here, when I do this guy, I will new up a person whose name Brock. Okay, just hard coding that for now. Okay, I got a person. Here we go. So then let's put the model at the top. Okay. So that's going to render a straight-up form, nothing special. But what we used to use @HTML begin form for is to do build the routing table. And so they have these built-in ones called ASP action. Maybe we'll call it submit, for example. Okay. The label is a label for this input element, and I want this input element bound. So they have a for. Right? The label is ASP4, like this. And the span is where you usually would put like your validation. Validation message. I think that's it. If I get that wrong, I'll have to look that one up. Actually, it may be validation message 4. I forget if it is or not. We'll see in a second. Okay, but anyway, the point is there are these built-in ASP dash attributes, tag helpers, and what they're going to do is when you have ASP controller and action on the form with a method of post, then they will build up the action to the right URL from the routing table. The other thing that this will do is it'll actually put in your HTML anti-forgery token. If you ever have built forms in MVC prior to this, you always know that you should be putting in an anti-forgery token to prevent cross-site request forgery. And so these will actually add it automatically for you. So that's a really nice feature. The label, this is basically your equivalent of label. The label HTML helper, this is your equivalent of the text box HTML helper, and this is your equivalent of the validation message 4 HTML helper. And so if I go look at this, hopefully what I should see is the name should be filled in with the value Brock, which it is not, so I messed something up. But if I go look here, look what I forgot to do. So what I forgot to do was I forgot to register Microsoft's helpers. That's what I forgot to do. So just like I had to register my own here in the view imports, right, and Microsoft's are coming from their own assembly, right, which was this other one here, I didn't register them. So therefore, as far as Razor was concerned, they were just additional content in my HTML. So I'll add a tag helper for them. Okay, and it's that assembly, and what I'm going to use is the shortcut syntax, which is star, which says, hey, I want every tag helper out of that assembly. Okay, so just by adding this, hopefully by hitting refresh on my page, actually refresh here first, see if this worked. Hey, my name actually got filled in now, and the actual HTML, if you look, actually is now posting to the, well, that's not in there anywhere. I guess we'd have to go check that out. I don't think I have a submit, so maybe that's why I got blank string. Let's see if it's smart enough, if it's doing that dynamically. So, oh, they don't have MVC action macros either. So here we'll do, let's go back to the base routing table and see if it's going to pick that up. It'll probably pick that one up. I'm a little concerned about, it used to be an MVC5 if you had the attribute routing, that would trump the regular route table routing. So I actually don't know if that's going to do that here. So just for now, let me do it this way. Submit. This is going to be an HTTP post. Again, very important. Now we should be able to do our validate anti-forgery token as well. That still exists. This could take some model data. Doesn't really matter what I'm doing here. Yeah, that looks good. Let me go back and hit refresh now. See if I'm looking to see my action get filled in properly. Ah, there we go. So that definitely got filled in properly. Let's see if it's smart enough to handle the routing table. So let's call it, home/submit, for example. Again, this is an area I hadn't yet verified. Oh yeah, it was good enough to do that. It used to be that if you wanted this based on name, you would have to give this guy a name. And here we go. Here's the name. The name is actually submit. Okay. All right. So yeah, that looks the same as the last version. Okay. So the other thing we got here, by the way, is notice we got our for, we got our ID, we got our name, we got the value populated. I have the wrong one here. This one is not working properly. And then the other thing we end up getting here is the anti-forgery token that I had mentioned. So that's kind of a nice addition. Okay, and then for the validate one, it's just ASP validation for, not validation message. Okay, so if we do the validation for, then that incorrect attribute gets expanded to the right CSS class with whatever other stuff that you normally would have had there. So of course then, just like in the regular MVC, if you start to put things like required, and you start to put things like, min length, for example, the various validation attributes. Then, if we hit refresh, then we should see additional attributes are going to be rendered out here for the client-side validation features, which is what we got here. Okay. Okay, so I'm actually running pretty late here, so I'll just mention the next obvious thing is to look at client-side validation. Client-side validation really hasn't changed in MVC6. You would still need to include the jQuery validate libraries that we included in the past. Okay, so I don't have those in here, so we're not going to see any client-side validation, but you would need to add those as well. So again, maybe we'll have to have a different webinar when we talk about things like that. So. Last topic here then is Web API, and so with Web API, things look a little differently than they did in ASP.NET Web API version 2, and again it's because, like I said, MVC6 combines both MVC5 and Web API 2. So in other words, if you're building APIs, they are going to sit on top of this framework that I've already been talking about for like the last 45 minutes or an hour here. We're going to be using just controllers, just like any other controller. So just real quickly, let me go build a controller for you. I meant this to be something like a person controller, right? And let's just go create some public class person. Just real quick like model data, for example. We have name, and we have age, for example. And again, I'm not going to bother hooking up a real database, but what I want to do is do something like static, list of person model people, just to kind of illustrate some real simple data here. Okay, 32 sounds great to me. Okay, so we have Alice, we have Bob, right? And Bob is 42 and Alice is 52. Okay, so what we're going to want to do here is we might want to do something like routing, like we had before. I might want to make this an API route and do /people, for example. And then I may have my index routine. Again, we might name it get to be more in line with our prior, Web API style. But again, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do HTTP get. And then in terms of my route, I'm just going to put the empty string, which really just means we're going to inherit that from up there. Okay? And so what I'm going to do now is I want to return all of the people, for example. So Vue is all about rendering HTML. How do we do rendering, of data back in Web API or Web API style within MVC6? So what we have is a new action result type called a new object result. And the object result is where I pass in my data. Okay? And so the idea is that what an object result is going to do is it's an implementation of iAction result, and this will then take the data you have and serialize it out to the caller, and it will honor the content negotiation that you are used to with Web API. And so it will serialize it out into a format that's consumable by the programmatic client. Okay? So let me run this and just see what I get. And so if I come into /API/people and hit enter, hey, look at that. I actually got some data back. Okay? Now, if in the past you had done this with Web API 2, then what you would end up getting is XML. Okay? And that's because in Web API version 2, we had two formatters, one for JSON and one for XML, and they were then registered globally. And what would happen here is your browser would actually request XML, because browsers tend to put XML in their accept header, and the content negotiation honors that and renders it. So several things now here are different. One is that in MVC6, the only type of formatter that is here by default is JSON. So the XML formatter is actually not involved. The XML formatter is in a separate assembly. So if you wanted to add XML formatting, you would have to add that in. The other thing, actually, this is maybe much more fundamental, is that there are actually no longer one list of formatters for both input formatting and output formatting. That has now been broken up into two different lists in MVC6. So there are a different set of components that do input formatting when someone is submitting data up, and then it's different than the list of rendered for rendering or output formatting. So again, by default, XML is in neither list. So if you wanted to add XML, you could. You would go into your project.json, you would pull in Microsoft ASP.NET MVC XML, and that is the XML formatting package, so it's another NuGet. You would have to then go teach MVC to do this. And so as I mentioned earlier, we had our MVC. This is where we configured MVC. MVC then has output formatters, and you would add a new XML, actually it's called the data contract. There are actually two XML formatters, and I got to remember the names of them. Let's go pull in the namespace, because I think that will help me find them. Oh, well, I guess I could have just done it here. Microsoft, ASP.ASP.NET, MVC, XML, and then there are two that do XML. There's actually the XML serializer implementation, and then I think there's the data contract serializer somewhere in here. There it is. And so there is the output formatter. Okay? So if you do want XML support, then you have to explicitly add it like this. Okay? Now, unfortunately, I'm going to hit refresh here, and that's still not going to work. And that's because it turns out that one other thing they changed in MVC6 is that if the user agent making the request looks like a browser, then what happens is they ignore the XML request, and they instead emit JSON. So even though XML is being requested, because the browser is also saying */*, if we actually look in the accept header, the browser is basically saying it accepts XML, but it also accepts anything. So on the server, Web API, because it looks like a browser, is sort of ignoring the XML, and it's saying, oh, well, you take anything, so we're going to give you back JSON. Again, I just think that's for development experience, because developers are used to looking at JSON if they're using their browser, right? Normally, a browser is not what's consuming your Web API. So if you actually much prefer the XML format, then there's another setting in here called respect browser accept header true, which is kind of a funny setting. So now if I hit refresh here, because the browser is now asking for XML, and because now we have configured XML, you can get XML back. Okay. So anyway, that kind of tells you which way they're going. If you have to go through all these hoops to get XML back, Microsoft basically thinks, yeah, people didn't use XML a lot, and so therefore pretty much JSON is what most people want and use. Okay. But anyway, you can get it back if you want. So that's how we deal with output formatting, if you will. And again, we can do all the same stuff we had before. So maybe we have another version of this where we pass in the ID We can still do the attribute routing that we talked about before, int ID, and we could do people of, for example, ID. You know, maybe I'm just hard coding into my list. We could even do things like if ID is greater than or equal to the people.count, then maybe I return a HTTP not found, right? This is the typical, you know, you're going to return an actual result which returns 404. Otherwise, return object content for, you know, my people. So let's run this real quick just to show this. So people/1, for example, should get one of my items in the list. If I do people of 10, that should give me back a 404. Good. Okay. One other thing you can do, by the way, back to the output formatting, is you can also say produces. So you can actually application XML. You can actually put a produces attribute, and that trumps everything. That basically says, hey, we're always going to render XML. I got to go to a valid one, though. Oh, I unregistered my formatter. I need to re-register it if I want to support XML. There we go. Okay, so here I got XML because my controller, you know, said it wanted to do that. There's also a property on the object result, which is the media type that you want to use. So you can also do it dynamically and pick, oh, for this request JSON, this request XML. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is then submitting data up to the server, which is basically with a like a put or a post, for example. So let's do the standard put, where we pass in the people model. So this is some sort of you know, data being submitted. This is going to be an HTTP put, for example. Same thing. We you know, maybe we support we have not found. We have people of, you know, of I, and again, this is my hacky database. I don't really have a real database, so and then maybe we'll do a return HTTP status code result of status status codes. I think it's called HTTP. They have a new, there we go, status code, no content, for example. Actually, you know what? This is the wrong one. They have another one. It's in the new HTTP utility. I may not have that referenced, but they have actually a whole bunch of other yet another enum for a bunch of status codes here. So, okay, what did I mess up here? I need a semicolon, and people of ID is what I got there. Okay, that looks good. So we could probably do a put here. Let's see if this is going to work or not. To do a put, I don't have a client, so let's just use good old Fiddler here to hack this up. So bear with me here. So we're going to go to people of 1. Great. So let's go to my composer. Let's do a put. We'll paste in that URL like this, and I want that data, and I'll paste it in here. And so we'll update, you know, update Alice to be 53, for example. So we're going to need content type, application, in this case is JSON. Okay, so actually I don't think this is going to work right away because actually, yeah, we ended up hitting the wrong, well, let's see what happened here. This may have not worked for the wrong reason, if that makes sense. Okay, let me go back to the composer. Let me trigger a put. So we actually made it to the put. We got ID 1, but the problem here is that the model, I think we ended up getting no data. Right. So this is the last thing that has to do with model binding in MVC6. So the model binding I mentioned, we can do model binding if the data coming in is either in the query string, you know, or the URL is a route parameter like we have here, or if the data is form URL encoded. But if you have data coming in that's application JSON or application XML, then we need to trigger a little bit different model binding. And so they have a different way to trigger model binding, which is this attribute called fromBody. So I think this existed actually in Web API 2, but now it's mandatory in MVC6, at least with the beta that we're on right now, is that you have to do the fromBody here to tell MVC, excuse me, to grab the data from the anything other than form URL encoded. Okay, so this will then go to the input formatters and go through them to see if they can handle the content type being submitted up. Okay, so I'll run this one more time, and now that I have from body, I think my fiddler should be able to submit this up. If I hit execute, we end up getting in here, and now my bottle data has been properly populated. Okay. In terms of like the rest of what your web API looks like, it's probably not too terribly different. Hey, 204, that was a good success. So anyway, the rest of this is really not too different from what I found. Again, there's just a couple little different gotchas about the way model binding works and the various status codes that you might want to return. So there are some things that are a little bit different. But in general, at least when I build my web APIs, there tend to be a very thin layer on top of the rest of the business layer of my app. So I don't actually end up putting a ton of code into these things. I put as little as possible just to kind of bridge from the HTTP layer into the code of my server. And so the pattern here ends up being very, very similar to the way it used to be in Web API. Okay? It's just that now we're on top of the MVC6 framework, so we have to kind of work with that style of programming. Okay, I have pretty much gone through all these things. All these slides. Oh, the one last thing I wanted to mention, there is the thing called the XML compatibility shim. If you have a lot of code written in Web API 2 and you're trying to port it over, they have a NuGet that will provide you with classes that look like all of the classes from Web API 2. So for example, like there used to be an API controller base class that doesn't exist anymore. Okay, so and that had a whole bunch of helper methods, and there were XML HTTP request object and the HTTP response object and all of those things. They don't exist in this framework anymore. So that's what this compatibility layer is supposed to do, is provide you those things that will compile like they were in Web API 2, but they map to this new framework. Okay, at least it's an attempt. I don't think it's perfect, but at least it's again, if you have tons and tons of code of Web API 2 and you want to migrate, this might be something to look into. Okay, so anyway, that's basically all I had. Again, I mean, we just sort of skimmed the surface here, but hopefully I touched on some of the more interesting parts of MVC and Web API that have changed. So again, come and feel free to check out the Developmentor website. Like I said, this is really meant to promote the ASP.NET 5 and the MVC6 class that we're going to have later this year. And of course, we'll go into a lot more detail in the class. As far as this webinar, the slides and the demos and the recording of the video will be posted up on the Developmentor website as well. So you guys should be able to access that. Okay? So thanks for coming.